The information shared in this podcast and related media is intended to provide broad consumer understanding and knowledge of healthcare topics as they pertain to remote work. All content herein is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Further, this information should not be used in place of a visit, call, consultation, or advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. The owners of this content do not recommend the self-management of health problems. Should you have any healthcare-related questions, please call or see your physician or other healthcare provider promptly. You should never disregard medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen or heard on this podcast or read in related media. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor, seek professional help, or call 911 immediately.
Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast Mental Health Series. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. The purpose of this series is to destigmatize the mental health issues commonly found in the remote work community. We have partnered with doctors, therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals for a series of in-depth discussions on a broad range of topics, ranging from isolation and depression to crafting meaningful relationships with others, and maybe more importantly, with ourselves. Our guest experts will share their insights in order to arm teams and leaders with the tools they need to thrive now and in the future. Mental health has always been a relevant issue for remote workers, freelancers, and distributed teams. But in today's climate, the subject is becoming more and more pertinent each and every day. I look forward to sharing this valuable information with you, and please join the conversation online, on the socials, or wherever the audience most suited to hear it can get involved. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by TeamMadeApart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. Before introducing my guest, I want to quickly thank everyone who's tuned in this week and each week during the tenure of this mental health series. I am so grateful for the willingness of all the experts who have appeared on the show taking a chance on us and delivering the goods to people in need now during COVID and in the future when we're likely to need mental health support more than ever. It has been truly a pleasure to work with each of these individuals, and I hope that the content has provided much needed solace and value for our remote working community specifically, but for the greater human community in general. Thanks again for all of your support now and in the future, and now allow me to introduce our guest. Today's special guest is Wesley Anne Little. Wesley is a relationship therapist certified in emotionally focused couples therapy based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Wesley helps people to understand what is actually happening in their relationships and in themselves to help them realize that they have much more power in interaction and outcome than they think. Here to discuss creating deeper connections with ourselves and those around us, developing curiosity and real empathy, fostering trust in professional relationships, our employer's role in our mental health, and so much more, please join me in welcoming to the show, Wesley Little. Hi, Wesley. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm so excited to be here and be talking to you.
Yeah, I am thrilled to have you here. I know that you have specific expertise in and around sort of interpersonal relationships and relationships between, how we might work with our employers and couples and everything. And so I think you're going to have a really interesting perspective that we haven't really spent a lot of time on in this mental health series. So I'm really grateful for your time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I love talking about relationships, so I'm always happy to do that.
That's awesome. So do you mind, can we sort of just start at the beginning? Let's talk a little bit about you quickly and, what your background is, where you come from and what you do.
Yeah, yeah. So I am a psychotherapist and I specialize in couples. And so, that means that I work with people who are in relationship and who are experiencing struggles within that relationship with each other. And I've been a therapist for a little over 6 years and exclusively with couples for a little over 3 years.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, no, that's great. And I think, it's interesting, as I talk about, I mean, in our organization, we talk about relationships, ad nauseum. But the idea is that I think so many people get caught up, especially as I'm talking here to a couples therapist, they're thinking, oh God, well, we're not talking romantic relationships here. There's a difference. But it's funny too, how many things are in parallel. The relationship you might build at home is the same relationship you might build with a boss, sans a couple aspects maybe. And so I wonder, could we just sort of talk about maybe, I don't know, sort of defining some terms? Let's set up a little bit like, what are we talking about when we're talking about a relationship? And sort of maybe what are some foundational aspects of developing one?
Yeah, sure. So I think that you're exactly right that, who we are in relationship, while it certainly will have different flavors or different intensity when it's a partnership, like a romantic partnership, how we are in relationship is really how we are in relationship with most people. And in fact, I think there's a really important new wave happening where business partners are getting couples therapy because, while there might not be a romantic aspect to that relationship, they depend on each other. The need for transparency, honesty, security, trust is all basically the same as a marriage. So I think that, really I kind of think of it as any way that we're in relationship with other people means that we're going to have the same stuff activated, the same communication tools are either going to work for us or not work for us. And if we expand it even beyond the couple into kind of a family thinking, that what we're really looking at is systems, right? So a family is a system and a company is a system. And even like a department within that company is a system. And anyone listening who has worked with someone who's really, really challenging in one of those systems, that everyone starts reacting to the one person who's the most challenging, right? So people start to accommodate too much. People start to lie. People start to, confront really aggressively. Like, everyone's going to be, reacting to this one entity, just like if someone in a family was particularly problematic.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, right? I mean, everybody who's smooth sailing is really easy to get along with, and it's easy to sort of, I guess, put them on the shelf and not worry about it. So you end up drawing all this extra attention to the one who is out loud.
Yeah. I mean, so I just see it as a parallel. There are certainly aspects that are a little bit different, in a romantic relationship, but I really think that there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome observation because one thing that has been really clear to me, as we're, presently experiencing COVID and the way that people are reacting to that and all these things, one of the things that I've found to sort of be true, or at least ring true to me, is this idea that despite all the sort of global chaos, so much has stayed the same, like foundational information, foundational knowledge, the way that we build relationships, the way that we communicate with one another, the tried and trues are still there. So the way I've been sort of picturing it is this idea that we've got our feet in concrete and the world is going crazy around us, but we are actually still really planted if we think about these foundational truths. And so I've heard a lot of podcasts and a lot of, interviews and stuff like this where people are so focused on the new normal or the new thing or what's next. But I keep finding in our conversations, especially on this mental health series, but in other conversations with remote experts, that so much about the way we always did things is the way we still do things. And for me, that's a little bit refreshing. I think it helps, back a little off on the anxiety, feel a little bit more, I guess, normalcy or a little more calmness in our lives. Because if you stop and think and you go, okay, well, everything's nuts, but it's actually just the same. The things I needed to be good at before are the things I need to be good at now. I think it sort of helps maybe take the edge off a little bit.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, the good news for a therapist is that human relationships are incredibly patternistic. Like we are built in a certain way, we operate in a certain way. This has been the case for as long as we're understanding humanity, and it will continue to be the case of how we interact with each other. And so that's good, because if I were encountering a brand new situation every time, it would be hard to be a good therapist. So the fact that it really follows the same pattern is helpful.
Yeah, it is interesting, right? Because we look at our world and sort of in these really short snippets, things look so chaotic and out of control. But it's like they say, right? History repeats itself, and all this stuff continues to happen that's always happened in one form, shape, or another. And so it's I don't know. I think we could take a little bit of a reprieve in that and understand that even no matter what we're feeling, other people have felt it, other people have dealt with it, and we can work through it. So yeah. I think that's encouraging.
I agree. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about, back to this idea of foundational relationships. I mean, can we talk, I guess, a little bit linearly about sort of the creation of a relationship in the beginning, the sorts of characteristics people should be espousing or working on to sort of make good those relationships, and and how we might sort of get that going in the context of, maybe, in remote work or even in a co-located environment, because I think it's generally the same.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So what I would encourage everyone listening to do is think about two main principles that we need for a healthy relationship. And then a relationship is constantly trying to find the balance between these two principles. So one is autonomy. I am seen for who I am as a person. I am valued for what is unique about me. And the second is security. That however many people are in the system, whether it's 2, 3, 10, that we have a sense of security within this system, that we can trust what people are telling us, that we have shared values, that we're working towards the same goal, that people are looking out for each other. That's the security. So sometimes with companies or couples, when someone wants to really focus on the security, that's when they can start sacrificing the autonomy, right? So they're saying like, oh my goodness, like I want to feel really safe that everyone is working as much as they can. I'm feeling a little bit nervous that people are taking too long of breaks while they're at home, right? So I'm going to implement a control. I'm going to make people log every single break that they have for as many minutes as they have, right? That manager might be trying to achieve a sense of security through that. At that point, it's starting to sacrifice the autonomy, where like someone's starting to feel like, hey, like, why can't I just, take a 15-minute break outside like a normal human? Like, why aren't you trusting that I'm going to be doing this work well? So all relationships are trying to balance these two things, and we need both of them in relationship. And I see this play out more with couples, but I think that it plays out just as much with work as well.
Well, you're not wrong, especially as it pertains to, a remote working environment. So much about a successful remote environment where people are allowed to go work autonomously from home or wherever. Micromanagement is one of those killers that we're always trying to knock down, right? And this is that idea of developing security for the manager who's maybe motivated by, I don't know, quarterly earnings or, something, right? There's some external thing that is making them behave in a certain way because they want these measurables. Right. And so micromanagement and trust is a really difficult thing for people to develop, I guess. Yeah. And then as it pertains to autonomy, it's probably sort of the same. I have a knack for really focusing on the end user or the remote worker themselves, but not paying maybe enough attention to the employer, who is also a human being. And those people, sort of need their autonomy too. And if they can't feel free to move about because their staff maybe isn't living up to obligations or something, then, they are then in a situation where they've got to maybe go back and look for the security. So it's an interesting dynamic, sort of how this works. And so in your mind, is it a matter of balance, like trying to get sort of equity between trust and autonomy and security? Or is it, I guess, is there room to push and pull?
Yeah. So I think when I think about, how to sort of achieve this state, I think of it in terms of both concepts I think you are well informed about because we emailed about them. I think about it in terms of both self-awareness and then good communication skills. So self-awareness is, the person, basically, if I'm going to overly simplify it, the person with the most power in a system needs to have the highest level of self-awareness. Like if you have the power, if you're a manager, I really think that you have a responsibility to start really doing some self-awareness work. Because that self-awareness would say, okay, let's say my boss is breathing down my neck, right? I have these quarterly earning things I have to hit. And I'm feeling anxious about, my employees the people underneath me not being able to deliver on that, right? So I would want that person to be using some self-awareness to be saying, okay, I'm anxious about this. I've kind of got a pressure myself from my boss. So instead of just launching into the behavior, like instead of launching into the control of like, okay, so I'm just going to implement that everyone has to record every second of their time. I would want them to first notice, like, I'm feeling anxious about this, and I want some kind of solution towards this, right? Because without self-awareness, they're going to automatically implement control. And that's where they're losing the ability to have the good communication tactic. Right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's a metaphor that I keep using for this lately that I think sort of relates. And it's sort of this idea that, if you're on an airplane and the air masks fall, right? The instruction is you're supposed to put it on yourself prior to helping somebody else. Even though your impulse might be to help your child, basically the principle is you're no good to them dead. Right. So you need to basically take care of yourself first and then help those around you. And so that's sort of the way that I've been looking at this idea of sort of intrapersonal communication and how we talk to ourselves, and the way that we sort of, build our relationship with ourselves is this idea that, we can't fully help others until we've managed to help ourselves. And so I think it's a pretty critical component.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that you're framing it in terms of self-care. Like, how do I take care of myself first? Because the manager, let's say like the manager who's automatically putting the control tactics in, they are trying to take care of themselves, right? By doing that, like they're trying to take care of their need by having the employees become micromanaged. So, but they're not aware that they're even doing that. They're not aware like, oh, I'm trying to take care of my anxiety. They're just reactively trying to take care of their anxiety. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's that sort of, at risk of sounding hippy dippy or something, it's mindfulness, right? It's this idea that you're really paying attention to what's going on in you and around you. And, as we were talking about with trust and micromanagement, so much of trust has to do with that. If you don't trust yourself, then it's pretty easy to see in other people that you might not be able to trust them too. Where if you have full confidence in your ability to manage a team, for example, then maybe you feel really good about the people working for you. And so I guess you'll wait for the problem instead of anticipating it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I can say that, when we talk about things like self-awareness, I've done a lot of therapy work. I've been a therapist for a long time. I went to grad school for therapy. I will be doing self-awareness work for the rest of my life. There are still lots of things where I'm working with my supervisor and I'm like, oh, I didn't see that was there. I didn't see that was driving this. So, that's just to normalize, it's not like, hey, I journal for 3 months and I've hit self-enlightenment. Like, this is a lifelong process to get better at self-awareness.
Yeah, and I think that's a good observation. And another thing that's sort of come up recently is this idea that there can be some fluidity in this stuff too. I think when you look at something like, developing trust or developing self-awareness, all this stuff, I think there's this implication that when you set out to do that, okay, well, now it's 5 days a week, I'm in therapy, it's this lifetime commitment, I'm chained in, I must do this. And so I think because of that, a lot of people just don't do it. And so I think that, this idea that it is lifelong, it is fluid, it can kind of come and go. You can put more focus that when maybe an issue comes up and maybe back it off and just sort of be mindful the rest of the time or something. Like I think understanding, or at least putting out there the idea that it's kind of, there's not a right way or a wrong way. It's just sort of understand that you should continue working on yourself, I think helps.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah. It's very fluid. And I think we would all burn out really fast if we were, driving ourselves to therapy twice a week and, just, hammering our brains with trying to get better.
Yeah. Well, and I say that particular instance kind of, from self-experience, for a little while I was seeing a therapist, and the idea for me was, okay, well, because I'm very this way, very sort of rigid with my routine. It's like, okay, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I see the therapist, blah, 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 blah. Do that for a couple of weeks. Well, then she has to cancel on a Wednesday. And then I'm like, okay, I guess I'm done. I'm never going again. And
Mm-hmm.
so much of it was because I built this routine and this pattern
Mm-hmm.
around that. And then as soon as the pattern was broken, it was really easy for me to shake it. And I've honestly never gone back.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I didn't get something out of it, or not because I didn't enjoy the time or any of that stuff. It's just now it's a problem. Now I have to try and work it back in. Now it's this whole thing. And so now I just don't do it. And so I guess I, talk therapists into having conversations with me, and this is how I get it instead of and so that's the only thing I can think of anyway.
Well, that sounds like a good technique.
Yeah, cry for help, I think. But I've gotten some really high dollar people, to just do this for free. So it works out pretty good. So let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about maybe sort of, I guess, recognizing in our relationships with people what's working and what isn't. So in a marriage, for example, maybe you're fighting a lot, whatever, like there might be some real clear indicators that something's working or something isn't. And I suppose in the office, maybe you have something similar. Maybe you have a boss that's always coming down on you or whatever. But so many of us sort of will put up with or sort of take abuse for a number of reasons, whether it is in a personal life or whether it's at work. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about just sort of, and maybe this goes back to self-awareness, but this idea of how we might sort of observe the relationship we're in and be able to act accordingly.
Yeah. So I think it's good. I think you're starting with the right step. Like, how do I observe the relationship I'm in? And I think that a lot of people, it would be very understandable to kind of jump ahead 10 steps and say, well, I have to have an income. This is the only option I have right now. I have to be in this work environment. And so I'm really just going to not even think about it. Like, I'm going to feel bad, but not think about it because I can't make a change right now. And I would have no judgment about that. I completely understand that people might feel like, hey, like I can't change my circumstance with work. So like, I just have to do that. Or in a marriage, right? Like they can feel like, hey, like, we've got 3 kids and finances are tight and I can't leave. And so I'm not even going to think about what isn't working here. So it really is actually, I think, quite an act of courage to even entertain the idea that something isn't working. I think that actually takes a lot of courage to do, because it's quite scary to feel like, hey, once I'm aware of how bad this feels, and then I'm simultaneously aware of how trapped I feel by it, that's actually very emotionally dysregulating.
Yeah. Well, and maybe it plays in a little bit to this topic then, sort of this idea of sort of attachment or attachment theory. These, this thought where maybe we become sort of dependent on that job, now it could be financial, right? So maybe we're doing the work because we have to. So it kind of is what it is, right? And I think that there's room for that in this sort of attachment thing. But I think what I'm talking about more is that we've developed some sort of emotional attachment to a job or an employer or whatever. And then there's kind of a mismatch that happens where, maybe we're giving more of ourselves than we should be, and they're not giving enough, or vice versa. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit, because I know that you have a little bit of background in attachment, and maybe I wonder if there's some parallels we can draw between sort of, standard attachment in a personal relationship to attachments that might take place in a professional environment.
Yes, I can speak for a long time about attachment theory. Okay. So to zoom out, attachment theory is simply saying humans attach to each other. Like we're not solo beings, right? So attachment theory is simply saying we attach to each other. Now that might sound very simple, but there are many, many, many therapy models and schools of thought that have been born out of this idea that we are actually solo and that we should simply only self-soothe and we should never rely on anyone. Attachment theory says we're hardwired for social connection. We're hardwired to want to be attached to some sort of person or some sort of people, because if we were out in the Sahara by ourselves, we would die. So it's a survival necessity to be somewhat connected to people. And, so if we drill down in terms of a couple, or I think a very similar parallel would be a business partnership, is that the more the more interconnected a couple is, because if you think about a couple or a business partnership, you're making financial sacrifice, right? Someone might pass up a promotion to stay in a city. Someone might stop working to have kids. You know, in a business partnership, someone is saying like, okay, we're going to pay rent on this really expensive place, but that's going to be kind of a risk. Like we both would have to be working really hard for this to work out, but like we're taking risks together. That means that we are looking at that other person and going, okay, man, like I'm getting in your canoe. You better row really well because like I'm going to row really well. And this thing will sink if one of us is not doing well. Right. And so that's when you can see that it's very easy for conflict and anxiety to happen if someone's like, hey, I don't think my partner is pulling their weight, or I think my partner is doing something unhealthy. Like, let's say you think your business partner is drinking too much, right? It's not just a matter of like, hey, I wish that this person wouldn't drink so much. It's actually a primal fear. It's like, hey, this is actually terrifying because we have $45,000 in rent that we need to pay. And if you're drinking a whole lot, you're not reliable. And like my life is going to be really bad if this doesn't work out. So attachment theory is basically saying, you know, it's natural that we are attaching to each other. And then that means that, you know, it really matters how the other person is acting or behaving.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So in the work environment, especially, you know, or maybe in a dynamic where you've got maybe a manager and a team he or she is running, you know, that sort of give and take, or that, you know, so that reliance on one another, back to our ideas of trust and avoiding micromanagement and things like that, this recognition of sort of our, I guess, sort of integral role with one another, you know, that, you know, neither of us together or on our own are whole, but together we're, you know, this machine that are required to make this happen, but any one piece missing can then break that up. I think that's a nice way of thinking about that.
Yeah. And so when it's healthy, like this is great. Like this is how things work because we're social animals and we're interconnected beings, right? And so when things are healthy, we're saying, okay, we can actually do amazing things. We can actually take huge risks when we have one or more people connected and pooling their resources and ability, right? This is sort of like why work is created in like multiple people, or why a family is created, because they're saying, hey, on my own, I might not have 3 children, but with a really great partner, I might have 3 children, right? So in a healthy relationship, the resources are multiplied, right? You have so many more resources to do it. And there's actually research that when we're in a healthy, connected relationship, we actually feel pain less. Like we feel physical pain less. Our bodies are literally giving us more resources. Now, what you were referring to earlier is we certainly can get caught in unhealthy attachment, right? So unhealthy attachment is when we're being mistreated, when, you know, we feel, you know, we just feel bad in that relationship, right? You get a pit in your stomach when they talk to you. You feel like you're worthless. You know, you feel totally underappreciated, talked down to. Like that's when your body's cueing you into like, this is not healthy attachment. And there are many, many reasons why it's understandable why it's hard to extricate yourself out of unhealthy attachment. So number one, a lot of people are coming from not so healthy family backgrounds, right? It might've been okay. It might've been not okay. But there have been aspects of your core primary attachment experience, which is your family of origin, right? Your family of origin is your first attachment experience. There are elements of that where your system became familiar with something. So let's say you grew up in a chaotic family, right? Like mom was always having big mood swings. Dad was staying out of the house, you know, for long periods at a time. When he came back in, he'd drink and then get angry at everybody. Like this is chaotic, right? There's not a lot of emotional security happening here. Maybe the parents loved the kids, right? Maybe they were like, got them to school on time and, you know, cared that they were in the play, but there was still a lot of emotional chaos in the house. Well, a 2-year-old isn't going to be able to be like, like mom and dad are like kind of messed up. Like they're contributing a lot of chaos here. The 2-year-old is simply breathing the air of chaos, and it feels not great, but it feels normal to them, right?
That's the enemy you know versus enemy you don't, I guess.
It's just the air you breathe. Like it literally just is, like your brain is developing with chaos being an element in the system. Now, there's still an element of the chaos that feels bad. It's not like this happens and someone's like, oh, I just feel good with chaos. But chaos feels familiar. Like you're saying, like as an adult, subconsciously, chaos is the enemy that you know, right? Mm-hmm. And if this was the environment you were raised in, you developed all sorts of excellent coping mechanisms with chaos. Maybe you are a superb peacemaker and you're like great at going between parties and kind of reasoning things out. Maybe you became really a really high achiever because it was the one time that the family kind of would, stop fighting and come together. There's going to be lots of ways that someone coped very well in those circumstances. Now, it breaks my heart that they have to cope with that, but I want to honor that those coping mechanisms were effective for them at that time. So now, so much of this is subconscious, but like, let's say they're working with a boss and they're like, God, this is really chaotic. Like their moods are all over the place and they keep like telling me to work on one project and then not on another project or whatever. And even though consciously they're like, I don't like this, they might consciously complain. Subconsciously, there might be something that feels like I deserve this, I'm used to this, I'm good at managing this, I'm needed here, I'm an essential person in this system. Like there's all sorts of subconscious stuff that's keeping us in that dynamic that we're not even aware of. In addition to that, it's very psychologically exhausting to be with someone who is really erratic, contemptuous, angry. And I can tell you, like, there is such a real psychological fatigue that sometimes people are just so exhausted they can't even take the time to process how they're feeling.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And it's funny just hearing you talk about this stuff. I mean, there's a handful of things I want to dive into or unpack from that. But so like, in my own life, and I don't know where it comes from in my upbringing, but like I would probably kind of fit that role of a peacekeeper, right? If things get a little bit chaotic or there's yelling in the house or whatever, or even if it's, in a professional environment or whatever, I'm usually the guy that wants to try and put us all in a corner and work through it until everything's copacetic again. Like I don't want to leave the room unhappy, right? And so, and so that tends to be my rap. My wife hates it, but I think it's kind of the, kind of something, and I don't know where it comes from, but I can recognize that characteristic in me, right? And so I understand that, there's people that come from a lot of different backgrounds and cope in a lot of different ways. And so that maybe leads into sort of this idea of sort of developing understanding and building empathy. I think empathy especially is one of these words that gets thrown around a lot lately. And especially the more we start to talk about mental health and sort of how important it is that we, become empathetic and develop that. But I'm not certain everybody even really knows what it means to be empathetic. I think there's a lot of, gray area around sympathy and empathy and blah, 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 empathy. And so I think that there's some ambiguation or ambiguity around that word, but also just sort of this ability to develop understanding of, somebody else's background, right? Like, so these coping mechanisms, again, back to my whole thing about maybe focusing too much energy on the worker and not enough energy on the manager, our managers have come up through weird, lives too, right? They've developed coping mechanisms and things like that too. And as we addressed earlier, maybe developing some self-awareness will help them overcome these things. But I think for the employee, understanding or recognizing in their boss or in their supervisor or whatever, that they may have some of these characteristics, I think this idea of developing understanding or building empathy is sort of a two-way street, and so a lot of times I have questions about sort of the role of the employer in our mental health versus the role of ourself. There's so much in the employment world that's, therapy should be included as a benefit, for an example. So that's great. That's maybe them reaching a little bit into our lives and trying to help us be better people by offering access to this stuff. But how much do you think is the role of the employer or the role of our employee, our manager specifically, in our helping us manage or navigate our mental health scenario, as much or versus how much is our problem? Like how much should we be accountable for in ourselves? I don't know if there's a clear answer, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know what you're asking, but you tell me if I'm going on the wrong track or anything. Okay, so I think in terms of like what responsibility does a company have to create access for mental health resources, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where a lot of companies are going towards that EAP route, where they're saying like, we're paying for 6 sessions or whatever it is, for a therapist, right? And I think that's great. Like, I think companies, and essentially what I'm saying is, I think people in power becoming more literate about mental health is a really positive thing. And we can see this across a giant spectrum. So this could be saying like, hey, I have the consciousness that an employee might be depressed versus lazy. I have a consciousness that someone might have ADHD versus a lack of willpower. I have a consciousness that I have clients I'm so automatic like that. I'm conscious that I have employees who have sensory processing differences. So loud noises and bright lights don't work well for them, versus seeing it as some sort of like a character flaw, right? So I think that again, like the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to educate yourself on how mental health or mental differences simply show up for people, because you're in the business of working with people. In terms of like, how much should a manager act as a therapist? That's where I think there should be a boundary. I don't think that a manager should act as a therapist and say, hey, John, you seem really depressed. Were you abused as a child? Right? Like, I think that employees need to have a private life and need to have the ability to not process anything that they don't want to about their mental health with their workplace. So I think, I think of it in terms of like literacy, but not like the role should be to be a therapist.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that hits it right on the head. I think it's sort of this delineation between the two, because I think there's a lot of pressure on a manager, for example, to be able to sort of, I guess, assess that we're going through something or dealing with something. And, I agree with you that there needs to be boundaries, right? Like, I mean, I guess you can be as comfortable as you feel, or you can be as intimate as you feel. And if you feel comfortable talking to them, saying, things aren't going well at home or whatever, that's your business. But I like the idea that maybe your employer doesn't need to dig in, rather just recognize there could be an issue, and then through policy or benefit package or whatever, support you in getting the help you need.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it's much more about sensitivity to it than it is about like the need to like process with the employee what's happening. Right. So like if you have an employee that comes to you and says, hey, I've just had my 3rd miscarriage and like, I need to leave work, that someone has the sensitivity of going, wow, that's trauma. This person is going to need days off. They're going to need accommodation for this. They're going to need resources, offered. I'm not going to like call them up and ask them, every aspect of how they're feeling, but I have the sensitivity that like, that's a psychological trauma.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I would like to maybe shift gears a little bit back into just sort of, relationship building and how we do this kind of thing. And I think one of the things, just to sort of dovetail off of what we were just talking about, this idea of empathy and maybe being able to develop an empathy or create a level of understanding between other people, making sure folks feel heard, that sort of thing. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of developing curiosity and developing empathy as sort of as a modality, back to this idea I was mentioning earlier about, empathy being something we throw around. I feel like sometimes there's a little bit of a fake it till you make it idea where like you can kind of put on an air of empathy, but not really be all that empathetic. I wonder if you had some thoughts about that, or maybe how people could sort of strengthen this as a skill. This is something we actually develop and maybe can become better at.
I think I love how you're saying this, Ryan, and I think you're bringing it up in exactly the right way. I think curiosity is way more important than like I sound nice to someone who's in pain, right? So when I think of empathy, what I really think about is, do I want to see the person in front of me as a unique individual with different feelings and thoughts than I have? Right? Like, am I curious about what this person in front of me might have experienced, be experiencing, be thinking, that kind of thing. Right?
Yeah.
Now, if I'm open to that, I might be moved emotionally by it, right? Like if someone is saying, hey, like I'm having a really hard time. I feel like in many work circumstances, or relationships, I feel like people haven't seen me as intelligent. And so whenever you question me in a meeting, I, start to feel bad inside, right? Where I start to feel like, do you not see me as intelligent? So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, this person has a valid experience, right? And I'm going to be open to that. And then I might be emotionally moved by it because I'm open to it. I might be like, oh, wow, like that feels really sad. Like I feel sad that this person has experienced this. The opposite of this would be dismissing that this person has had an alternate experience. So the opposite of this would be something like, everybody experiences that. You just need to get over it. What you really need to work on is leadership skills. You need to work on using your voice more, right? So that's like a total steamroll over that person's alternate experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I wonder, where this factors in. It sort of maybe seems like maybe a middle ground, but there's this aspect of empathy, or this place where things kind of go too far, where we hear what you're saying, and rather than just letting it be or recognizing your thing and I guess being empathetic to that, we switch into this like paternalistic mode where it's, I can fix you. Like, I know how to solve your problem. You're not capable of solving this, but I can solve it. And I think sometimes that happens where somebody thinks they're being empathetic, right? They're understanding your plight and now they can solve it for you, whether they can or not. But it's also kind of in line with what you're saying about being a little bit dismissive, right? It's, whatever you can do, don't worry about it. I can fix it for you. And so I wonder if you talk about that sort of maybe as a middle ground between those two scenarios that we were just discussing.
Yes. So I actually can exactly explain psychologically what's happening in that moment. So let's play out the function of that behavior. Okay. So let's say someone is listening to someone in pain and they're saying, I can fix it for you. The function of that behavior is that they don't want the other person to be in pain anymore. Right? Mm-hmm. If that person is in pain, I have to feel pain. I have to sit with pain. And human beings are mostly not great at sitting with pain. So I have to feel a bunch of uncomfortable emotions if I just sit with what someone is actually feeling. I might feel sad. I might feel helpless. I might feel angry that someone's mistreating them. I might feel scared about what would happen if this person doesn't get help with something. So fixing it is a direct route out of emotion. If I'm fixing, I don't have to sit with feeling.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, and hearing you explain it that way, I think sort of helps me understand, what it is, because it rings very true to me that the idea is what you're actually trying to do is evade the feelings that are being brought up by this thing. Right. So as a manager, or just as a friend, or as a partner or whatever, how do we, I guess, understand what to do with this stuff, right? So, I mean, there is the version of it where you're just allowed to say what you want. Maybe you need to vent and you just need someone to, just somebody to hear it out loud. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes there actually is something in there that is actionable. Maybe it's a little bit of a cry for help, or it's a little bit of a help me please kind of thing, somebody expressing, that there's abuse in the household or something, and you do need to act. Mm-hmm. Is there, I guess, any markers or flags or things that we should be watching for to sort of decide whether it's kind of a case of, pay attention to me, please, or that there really is something wrong and that maybe or not we should act?
The good news is that we don't have to psychically know that because the person in front of us can tell us. So all we have to do is ask that question. Is this what, so like with my husband and I, let's say we're taking a walk and he's telling me about something that's stressful for him, right? I have I want to fix things for him, right? It hurts me if he's in pain about something. Even though I know better, I have that urgency come up. And so in that moment, I would take a deep breath to regulate myself. And I would say to him, do you just want to tell me about this and just have me understand it? Or do you want some ideas on a way to come out of it? And then sometimes he'll say, no, I just kind of want to talk to you about it. And I'm like, great, I'm totally here for that. And sometimes he's like, no, hit me with some ideas. And I'm like, awesome. That's far more comfortable. I'd be thrilled to do that.
Well, and maybe that makes sense to sort of just slip into a little bit of a conversation about sort of transparency and honesty. Mm-hmm. And so, as a factor of trust and many of the other things we've discussed throughout this conversation, a big part of these relationships and developing deeper connections is this idea of being transparent or being honest. And there is such a thing as being aggressively honest, which is mm-hmm. that version where we're giving advice when it's unsolicited. Mm-hmm. But but there's also something to being transparent mm-hmm. or, I guess, I don't know if it's intimacy or what it is, but sort of allowing people behind the veil a little bit and giving them mm-hmm. sort of a look at what's going on with you. So do you mind talking about sort of those as aspects mm-hmm. of relationship development?
Exactly. Yeah, totally. I don't think that people avoid transparency mostly because they don't want to. I think it just doesn't occur to people to be transparent. Like, it doesn't even occur to me all the time to be transparent. So what we're used to doing is like thinking something where we're like you just gave the perfect example, right? Like, I don't know if this person wants me to like empathize with them or if this person wants me to like problem solve with them. It just doesn't really occur to us in the moment to say out loud what we're processing. So the practice of transparency, I think for a lot of people is simply just getting used to naming what you're actually thinking. So in a romantic relationship, like if there's an argument, a piece of transparency that is extremely rarely ever said out loud is, I'm feeling really anxious right now. I mean, very rare that a couple arguing would say, I'm feeling really anxious right now. But that's true. It's what everyone's feeling.
Yeah.
So
well, I think that's right. I was going to say, because so much of this stuff too around transparency, I think can be sort of a fear or a trepidation to say out loud what you're thinking, for fear of either repercussion or, mm-hmm. whatever. I know that sort of in a relationship, we've talked a little bit about sort of this give and take. And this idea that, basically at any given time, in a relationship, you're either exposing fears or removing security, or back to our model earlier of autonomy and security, we're pulling from one thing or giving to another, or maybe pulling from both. And that's what's creating the friction in our relationships, is that stuff. And so I think it does make sense, that you need to be open and honest and be able to sort of describe what's going on. But I like this idea, and maybe you can talk a little further about it, this ability or this idea of sort of almost like stream of consciousness, like you're mm-hmm. just sort of explaining what's going on in your head or in your body in that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't think of it like, so, okay, let's think about transparency in terms of tiers or like a staircase going down. So at the bottom of the staircase is going to be the super vulnerable emotions, right? And I don't think that someone needs to put pressure on themselves of like, I need to be honest, so I need to dig out my most vulnerable emotions right now. I mean, yes, vulnerability is really helpful, but in the middle of some sort of a conflict or in the middle of like an anxious meeting at work, you're not conscious of the super vulnerable emotions in that moment, right? You're more conscious of anxiety or frustration. Those are generally the first emotions that we're aware of. So I think of it, probably more like increasing the awareness that in these moments, one option would be to say, hey, I'm not really sure the right move here, right? Or, hey, I'm feeling kind of a double bind. On one hand, I'm hearing you say you want this, and on the other hand, I'm hearing you say you want this. these are not super vulnerable, but they're usually the internal thoughts that we're having. Mm-hmm. And so if we get more used to instead of walking out of the room, or instead of just shutting down internally, or instead of, starting to escalate our voices, if we're kind of aware, oh, I'm feeling stuck, I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling stuck, just saying that out loud can release so much pressure that's happening. And, hopefully you're in a dialogue where the other person would be like, oh, okay, I get it. We need to slow down here. We need to kind of do something different. Because the alternative is that we don't really often look stuck or anxious. We tend to look indifferent, defensive, annoyed, it's not translating, right? So to verbalize it helps the other person know oh, it's not that they're annoyed with me. It's that they're feeling like they're in a double bind right now.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. So as a bit of a, gear shift, just because we're starting to get down to the end here, I wanted to ask you about sort of developing deeper connections with people while we're in a situation where people are working remotely. I know that for a lot of therapists, you guys have moved remote and you're doing a lot of work by Zoom or whatever now. Mm-hmm. And so sort of my theory or my take on this is sort of this idea of filling a glass of water for satiation. So it's this idea that, maybe a text message is, I don't know, a couple drops of water, and an email is a few more drops. And, a personal letter might be, half a glass or something, and, and so on and so on, with video communication being maybe 90% of the way to satiation. But the only way to fully get satiated is that person-to-person, in-person connection. Mm-hmm. And for me, that sort of model seems to fit pretty well, because for me, I sort of put utmost value on that moment with somebody else and being able to sort of look into the eyes and see the body language and all that stuff. Some of the things we're missing in a Zoom call. Mm-hmm. And so, but I wonder if you would sort of just talk about the importance of, connection to other people in how we can maybe kind of facilitate it or do the best we can, now in a situation where people are largely remote. Mm-hmm. In the past, I know right now, especially, there are a lot of employers trying to do fun things to fill in your social hours and stuff like that, with the online coffee breaks and things like that. And in the past, I would have looked at those things and said, okay, I don't need my employer to take care of my social life. I'll work my day and then I'll go meet somebody for coffee. But now things are a little bit different. And so I wondered if you'd just sort of talk a little bit about just, forming deep connections or building the best connections we can using the channels that are sort of widely available to us now.
Yeah, so you might not like my answer. I'm just going to say that up front, but I'll tell you how I really think about this. So I really think that this is a place where it's kind of actually a fun thing to think I want to figure out what kind of connection I need right now, right? So I think that, connection is a really broad term, and actually people really need different kinds of connection. So I think the more someone can just have fun exploring, what do I really need right now? Because there's actually a lot of invitations for connection all over the place right now that we can feel oh my gosh, my friend wants to Zoom chat with me and I should do that because we're in this period of isolation and it's good for me to have Zoom chats, right? Or my employer is doing a happy hour Zoom and I should do that because I don't want to die alone and be miserable, right? But I do think it's really worth figuring out what kind of connection do you need? So for me personally, I spend all day long in very deep, very painful emotion. The last thing I want is some sort of deep emotional conversation outside of work. What I really want is to just laugh with a friend. I wanted to joke around. I want to talk about stupid nonsense. That's actually what I need. So knowing that tells me, okay, I need this friend because this is my joking around funny friend. I want to have a glass of wine with them. And I just want to shoot the breeze and talk about nothing serious. Right. Mm-hmm. I might send a silly postcard to my niece, who's 4, right? I know that what I really crave is fun, light, frivolous. Now, if you're someone who's spending all day in a joke shop, and you're like, what I'm really craving is something deep and something meaningful, then that will indicate to you like, okay, so what I really need then is I want to have a serious talk with my most serious friend, or I want to like read or watch something like very moving or very deep, and I want to, you know, talk to a friend about that. So what I would really invite people to do is cut out the generic shit and do what really feels good to you, and like really explore, like, and give yourself permission. Like, hey, like, I don't want to do this kind of connection. It doesn't feel great to me. It's not filling up my cup. I really want this kind of connection. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And back to this idea we discussed earlier of fluidity, right? I mean, you've got to sort of be able to be doing the things that are good for you. And, you know, behaving in ways that sort of scratch your itches or whatever. I mean, my only pushback, or the only thought that occurred to me is like, so in a situation like yours, I mean, obviously you're invested in your clients' lives. So you're hearing people, you know, maybe on good days, but largely on their worst days. And so, you know, so for you, obviously a little brevity after work is pretty nice. But do you find, does that keep you from making great connections with those people? Does it say sort of top level, let's joke, let's screw around and all that stuff, but maybe, I don't know, hide the rest? You know, like, are you keeping yourself from getting to know somebody in a more personal way or a more intimate way because what you need from them is this, and, you know, what they provide might be that, but maybe neither of you are getting, you know, some other component of that relationship met?
I think it does. And so how I would respond to that is with the people who I want to talk to right now, like in COVID time, I mean, these are people I've known for years or maybe even decades. And so we've had really deep relationships. Like, we've had the, you know, epic all night talks. But there is, I think that, you know, when we, and I'll get a little gendery here if I can. Like, I think we look at female relationships like what you should do is be in deep connection all the time. And when we look at male relationships, we're saying what you shouldn't do is be in deep emotional connection all the time. So I think there is probably, you know, a balancing where, you know, we could really investigate like what does a person actually need in each camp. So I will say, like, yes, like at this point in my life, I have very few people who I have the bandwidth to like have a deep conversation, because that's what I spend 8 hours a day doing.
Sure. I'm
okay with that. If someone's not okay with it, then they probably don't want to be friends with me right now. But in terms of like, would I still be open to deep connection? Of course, like but for me, like, that's like breathing. Like, yeah. I can launch into deep connection at any point, at any time with anyone. So I actually have to be much more intentional about the light stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like that. I think that's a good response, you know, and it's funny, just the stereotypes, right? Because like, I fall into that bucket entirely. You know, there are very few friends, and I've got friends that I've known since I was 5 and 6 years old. You know, but largely we've never had deep conversation. We've never been in any of those spots. We are in screw around mode all the time. And so, you know, and that works for us and it's been fine. But, you know, I haven't felt the need to open up to them, but I like the, you know, back to this concept of fluidity, this idea that you could, if you wanted to. So yeah. I think that's great. Well, so here in closing, I've just got one last quick question for you. I wondered, and this is, you know, much more practical or pragmatic, less theoretical maybe, but it's this idea that what is one thing that an employer could do to sort of see an impactful change in the way that they're taking care of the mental health of their teams? And conversely, what is the one thing that I, as a remote worker, should be doing to take care of my own mental health?
Okay, so I would say for the employee, think about if your policies are built for good mental health. Like, and by policies, I don't mean EAP. I mean, do you have a realistic expectation of the work on your employees? And are you really listening to the feedback that they're giving you? So I would see this as saying, like, take in employee feedback, really listen to it, and really consider if your way of working is set up for mental health. This is going to look at racism. This is going to look at sexism. This is also just going to look at the demand on the employees. That's the best thing an employer can do, is to say, are we creating an environment that is fundamentally healthy?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And for the employee, which is basically what we're saying is like just an individual person, what I would suggest doing is really taking an inventory of how you actually feel. Like, do you dread every day getting up? Do you have high anxiety starting certain meetings? How are you actually doing? And then if you're like, I'm not doing great, then I would recommend seeking out therapy, seeking out some sort of, a coach, figuring out if you want to try exercise instead of those things. Like, there's a million things you can try to do. But, one of my favorite quotes of therapy is, you can't solve a problem you don't have. So first you got to see, like, do I have a problem? Like, is something not working for me?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, and it goes back to all our self-awareness discussion and all that other stuff. So cool. Well, so to just kind of wind things down and put a pin in this thing, where can people learn more about your practice, about you personally, or maybe connect with you if they felt so inclined?
Yeah, if people want to stay connected to me, I think Instagram's the best place. So Wesley Anne with an E Little, and that's probably the best way to do it. I cannot see any clients who aren't in North Carolina, so therapists are licensed by state. So I probably won't counsel people who are listening, but you can follow my Instagram for tips and different pieces.
Cool. And we will be sure to direct a few North Carolinians your way. So cool. Well, thank you so much, Wesley. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for carving out a slot to have this conversation.
It was a pleasure to talk to you, Ryan. Thank you so much.
Of course. And thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week, and we'll see you guys next time.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you